Thank you to everybody really for giving us an opportunity to present at this conference. It's incredibly exciting for us to be at an event where we've got other people who are so interested and invested in making sure that young people have a voice in how our places are shaped, because that's a huge part of what we're all about. And we're specifically about trying to make sure that the voices of girls and other people, other young people who don't necessarily fit within the standard young masculine stereotype that we're seeing catered for at the moment. As Ia said, we're a relatively new charity. We sort of started in March of this year, and we're all about trying to make parks and similar spaces as welcoming to teenage girls as they are to teenage boys. And we sort of start with that quote there from Lily, who, answered the perfectly reasonable question, what do you like doing in the park? Responded, well, why would I go to the park? There's nothing there for me, completely unprompted. So what we're about is trying to counter that. So just the shape of the presentation we're going to do today. Firstly, just, is there a problem here? Is there a gender blind spot when it comes to parks? Why should organisations look at parks differently? I mean, we've had what we've had for ages and people still love parks. So, why look at things any differently? Then we'll talk a little bit about what better might look like. And then finally, we'll touch briefly on, what we're trying to do to create a platform so that the voices of teenage girls are included. So without sort of further ado, I'm going to hand over to Susanna Walker, who is the lead founder of Make Space for Girls. And she's going to start off by just looking at, is there a problem? So let me just move on to the next slide. Susanna.
Yeah, the next slide in which we answer our question. There is indeed a problem. It's an interesting question, though, because to some degree, the state of parks and the facilities we have, it's almost like water. We all swim around in it and don't really notice that it's there, but only when you really start to look at it do you realise that the facilities for teenagers in public parks tend to be predominantly used by boys. There's a kind of holy trinity of teenage facilities, and these are often included in local plans, in parks and green spaces plans, and these are the skate park, the Muga, the multi-use games area or fenced pitch, as most people would probably think of it, or a basketball court, and the BMX track. And these tend to, the only other thing that tends to ever get included in anything formal is a shelter, which at least is something that teenage girls could use, because all of these facilities tend to be dominated by boys. There's a lot of reasons for this. One is the way that they are designed. I mean, to some degree, just the sheer fact of their existence makes them more interesting to boys. There are more boys that play football than girls. There are more boys who skateboard than girls. But even taking that into account, these facilities tend to be heavily dominated by boys. This is partly because of the way they are designed, which tends not to make girls feel very comfortable in them, and we'll get into how that works later on. The other is that the boys can sometimes be territorial about spaces, and there's a certain amount of research now about how boys have an expectation, a right to public space in their heads, and that girls don't have this. So they allow themselves, that's the wrong word, they can be chased off by the boys, and the boys don't see a problem with this. And that girls are often expected to do different things. I mean, particularly when you look at intersectionality, and there are often cultural reasons why girls aren't coming to the park as well. But we don't want to fix the girls. This isn't about saying, oh, let's make all the girls just like the boys so that they can skateboard and football the same. If we fix parks, we can make them better. And it's, as Imogen said, it's not just about making it better for girls. Almost every change you make to public space will make it better for everybody and for a much wider range of people. So in the end, it's about equality in parks, and making things better for a whole range of people, not just about making space for girls. Next slide. Up until now, it has been a blind spot, and this is very definitely the case. You can see it by the provision, but also some of the reactions we've had have sort of continued the blind spot. Generally, I have to say, the reaction we've had so far has been incredible. People have been really positive, and mostly it's been exactly as Green Space Scotland said. We haven't thought about this, but yes, we really need to think about it. What shall we do? One of the things that gets raised is that we don't consider investments in our parks to be for either boys or girls. And this was actually said to us by a council. So, who exactly is it for? But also, that is a blind spot, because in reality, the provision is not being used equally. So we do need to look at it. We can't just go, oh, we're in some delightful gender neutral space where everybody can do what they like, because that's not the case. Equally, but girls can play football too, and yes, they absolutely can, but then why are they not getting the kick arounds on the Muga? Girls football is actually a really growing area, and 25% of new entrants to sort of grassroots football are girls, and yet the spaces are designed or end up so that the boys dominate them. So this is still something we need to look at. Why are you assuming girls don't want to skateboard? And the answer is we're not, but it's like with the Muga. They don't, at the moment, they are not using the facilities that are provided at the moment. And yes, there is the culture of skateboarding is not currently terribly welcoming to girls, but that's a whole other presentation that we could do for an entire half hour all on its own. And it's not about, the thing about skate parks as well is this is not about taking things away from people. It's about taking the facilities we've got and making them more equally accessible, but then also asking teenage girls what else they might like too. Not assuming that they are exactly like the boys and we just need to fix the facilities, but trying to provide something different as well. Next slide. One of the things that we've come up against in this is that there isn't as much data as we would like. So a lot of the examples at this stage have to come from Europe, because the research in this country is just, there isn't that much. This is something that we are working on and that we hope we can come up with some better data quite soon. But at the moment, a lot of our examples come from across Europe. So in Sweden, the imbalance for boys and girls in parks is 80-20 after the age of 8. And there's a big shift that happens once children go to the playgrounds on their own. When they're with parents, the parents are monitoring the situation, they're policing the park. Generally, things are pretty straightforward. But once children go on their own, boys tend to be in parks a great deal more than girls. And the boys are acting to keep this situation going. Vienna have done some really interesting work, which we'll see later, on making parks more accessible to girls. And as part of their research, they asked girls whether they would join in a game with older boys. And they would only dare ask half the time. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why they did even that much, because 87% of the time they were turned down. And as the research says, often with sexual insults. So as a result of this, girls tend to work around boys. You see this very clearly with skate parks, where the number of people who say, oh yes, I like to skateboard, but I go early in the morning before the boys get there. There is a sense that it's very much the boys' territory, and the girls are creeping around in the corners in the spaces that they are permitted, rather than actually being allowed to take charge of spaces. And girls know that this isn't great. Then Girl Guiding ran a really interesting survey a couple of years ago, because they were very aware that this is an issue, and 82% of girls thought there should be more, they should be more involved in designing parks and open spaces. And there was a very strong belief that there wasn't enough facilities for girls at the moment. But here we don't know very much. I mean, to give you just one example, the multi-use games areas are everywhere. There are tens of thousands of these fenced pitches all across the United Kingdom. And yet there is one bit of research has been done on them, which is about using them for youth work with boys. But councils are spending 30, 40,000 pounds a pop on one. And so I can't even begin to work out what that budget is. It's huge, and yet we know nothing about them. Next slide. So yes, this is part of the problem. For a lot of reasons, which the good thing is that people are now more aware of the issues because of Me Too, because of the Sarah Everard case, because of Everyone's Invited. There is an understanding now that life is not straightforward for teenage girls, and that they spend a lot of time thinking about their safety, thinking about where they're going. And this was very interesting that even in spaces where you know the people, it's not comfortable. Quite often Mugas are fenced with just one, maybe two entrances. And so if you've got a group of teenage boys in there, as a girl, you're clocking the safety all the time, even if you know them. So these are the kind of issues we have to start being aware of. Next slide. So yes, as I've said, there are tens of thousands of Mugas. We don't know much about them. We know that hard space play areas are used more by boys than girls, and that girls play more actively when there isn't such a thing. Mugas are also very prescriptive, which is something we'll come on to later. They tell you this is an area, not just an area of park we can do what you want with, this is for playing team games. And even if girls want to join in, there's not much research about Mugas, but there's a lot of research in schools that show that boys do not like girls taking part in team games, and they will actively exclude them. They will not pass to them. They will not let them join in. They're often quite rude. So Mugas, we know nothing about them, yet they are everywhere. Next slide. Skate parks also. I spoke to Izzy in the town I live in the south of England. We have a skate park, but I noticed that there were a lot of girls skating in a car park. And that's what she said to me. So there is a real territoriality that's keeping girls off the facilities. And they felt that they had to go and practice elsewhere in order to be good enough to be permitted to join the skate park, which is quite a concept when you actually think about it too hard. Next slide. So yes, we do have some statistics on skate parks, again, from around the world, not necessarily just from the UK. Skateboard GB reckons that 85% of skateboarders are male. The statistics come from around the world tend to come out somewhere around about that as well. And 80% of those are under 18. So that's a facility that is predominantly being used by teenage boys and not very many teenage girls. And this is a situation that is being maintained by the boys to the extent that, and we'll come on to the health issues around parks later on, but there was a set of American research where they fitted teenage girls with activity wristbands, and there's a direct correlation between how closely they lived to a park and the amount of activity they took. Absolutely straightforward, unless that park was a skate park, in which case their activity levels dropped. And so there is also a problem that skate parks, as they stand, gather huge groups of teenage boys and make a space difficult for teenage girls. So having said all these lovely positive things about them, they are very expensive. An average skate park would be £160,000, but the price is going up more and more as more of them are being made out of concrete rather than wood. And they take up a huge proportion of of the budget for facilities for teenagers. But it's never questioned that we should be spending maybe 2/3 of the budget on something that just benefits not even all teenage boys. But whenever somebody says, oh, let's have some teenage provision, it's always like, hey, let's have a skate park. So this is one of the things we're trying to get through, is that we need to ask more questions about what's being provided rather than just assuming that the stuff we've always done is good provision for all teenagers. Next slide. So there are very particular problems with skate parks, and a lot of those are to do with design. They tend to be produced by a small pressure group of very good skateboarders who then ask for a skateboard park that is designed for very good skateboarders, at which point it's terrifying for everybody else because it's got huge drops, dangerous runs, and so they become increasingly more exclusive almost through design. And again, this process isn't questioned, and girls are never going to get good enough. They're never going to be allowed to join in if we keep building them in this way. And so how do we then start to make a change, and why should we be thinking about it? And Imogen will look at some of the tools that are available to think about it.
Oh, yes, she says, trying to get her slide to now move. Oh, there we go. So why does this need to change? I suppose I put up 4 things there. You know, fairness, which I think anybody who's sort of been trying to work in the field of equality spends quite a lot of time saying, you know, appealing to people's better natures and just saying, well, you know, the current position is kind of unfair. And it is unfair. Girls should have facilities that meet their needs. We shouldn't have Lily at age 14 going, why would I go to the park? There's nothing there for me. That, you know, there's nothing there for me. We shouldn't have that. It's unfair that that's what's happening. But fairness isn't always the most persuasive argument, because you're coming from a sort of subservient position almost if you're saying, oh, it's not fair, you know. So what other reasons have we got? Health. Well, I'm coming on to some of the data, but we know that there are big problems with inactivity in teenage girls, and we know what inactivity does to people's physical and mental health. And I'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Similarly, safety. We were talking to some people who were working not with girls, but with women in the east of London. And they were talking about places, public spaces where women felt safe. And one of the saddest things that they came across was the number of grown women who simply didn't expect to feel safe in public space. You know, they'd given up on that idea. And we think it's incredibly important that girls grow up believing that they have a right to feel safe and a right to feel safe in the parks. And that's just not happening at the moment. It is quite upsetting, the number of people that we talk to, because we're talking to a lot of people who are involved in parks, who will just say, oh yeah, I mean, there was a rape in the park, you know, a couple of years ago, so we kind of, you know, we've had to cut down some of the undergrowth and stuff like that. You know, it's almost like a throwaway comment. Do you know what I mean? You know, and so are we surprised that girls aren't feeling safe? But we need to stop that situation. And then finally, you know, there's the law. If you can't appeal to people's better nature by saying, what about fairness? What about health? What about safety? Well, how about just going in there and saying, well, do you know what? It's just the law. And there are really 3 things. Aya mentioned the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also have the Equality Act, which is effective in Scotland as well, which prohibit direct and indirect discrimination. And what we see a lot in park provision is actually indirect discrimination. Nobody's putting up a big sign that says girls can't use the skate park, but something is going on so that they're not using the skate park. And that's indirect discrimination. Finally, there's a thing called the Public Sector Equality Duty. And that was again in the Equality Act 2010. It applies in Scotland as it does in England and in Wales. And what is this? I'm going to the Public Sector Equality Duty. The idea about the Public Sector Equality Duty was it was brought in to bring about a culture change so that promoting equality becomes part of a public authority's core business. And what it requires public authorities to do is when they're making decisions, they need to have due regard to the need to eliminate unlawful discrimination, advance equality of opportunity between advantaged and disadvantaged groups, and then foster good relationships between different groups. And I've put in bold there the obligation to have due regard to the need to advance equality of opportunity between advantaged and disadvantaged groups. Because what we see in park provision is we have an advantaged group, the teenage boys who are getting to use the Mugas, who are getting to use the skate parks, and we have a disadvantaged group, the teenage girls, who are simply not getting to use those facilities or indeed any other facility. And that means that local authorities, when they are thinking about planning their park provisions, are actually required by the law to have due regard to the need to advance the equality of the disadvantaged group, to advance the equality of opportunity for teenage girls. And this is, the public sector equality duty doesn't dictate outcomes. It doesn't tell the public authority, you have to do this, you have to make equal provision, but it does say you've got to think about it, and think about it quite seriously. And one of the things that we have come across, which has really surprised me because my background is in law, is that when it comes to planning decisions, this duty, which is very important in lots of other areas, this duty barely gets a look in. And we were talking to a planning barrister and he said, yeah, we don't know, doesn't really get discussed, nobody really focuses on it. And our point is, people need to focus on it. This is the law. This is not a nice to have. This is, oh, well, bit of fluffy political correctness gone mad. No, this is the law. If you're a local authority thinking about planning your park, you need to have due regard to the need to advance the opportunities for teenage girls in your parks. Now, due regard to, slightly fluffy term, but you do need to think about it. So as I say, so if you're sort of engaging with people and you find you've got quite a lot of resistance, this is there, it is the law. Health, I put some stats up there. I suspect everybody here is very familiar with the rather depressing statistics that we're seeing about teenage health. I've put up some of the stats there. It's really depressing, and it's not just physical health, it's also mental health. By the age of 14, 1 in 4 girls, are reporting high levels of symptoms. It's 1 in 10 in boys. Now, it's clearly not good that any number of our children are reporting these high levels, but for it to be 25% of the teenage girls, that's very high. As I said, note at the bottom of the slide there, things aren't really getting any better. Safety. There's a whole wider discussion about the safety of women and girls in public space. But it is very important in parks as well. And we've got some data there from the Swedish research. Teenage girls are feeling 10 times more unsafe than teenage boys. Now, perception of safety and actual safety are different things, and we acknowledge that. But we have to find a way to make these spaces feel more safe for girls. And when it comes to the link between safety and activity levels and health, again, there's been a study, not in the UK, but I can think of Sweden. Access to parks on its own doesn't necessarily encourage physical activity. It's got to be access to a safe park. The other thing to remember, of course, is for many teenage girls, parental permission is a key part of whether they feel comfortable going to the park. And it doesn't have to be parental permission in the sense of, I forbid you to go to the park. For a lot of teenage girls, if they know their parents will worry more if they go to the park, they won't go to the park. So it's not necessarily just parents sort of banning, it is also that sense, quite a strong sense that some teenage girls have of just not wanting to upset people. Sport. Sometimes when we open up this debate, people say, oh, the answer is to get more girls playing football. Look, sport versus play. Some girls love sport, and for girls who love sport, sport is absolutely fantastic. It's a brilliant way of getting active, and there's some fantastic work going on. This girl can, lots of initiatives getting more girls into football. The FA has done a fantastic job there. But there is a big group of girls who badge themselves and, you know, are badged by others as being non-sporty. And what they think about sport is, this is from Women in Sport, it is judgmental and rule driven, it can be stressful. And importantly, you know, it's another way to fail. So what we want to say to you is, you know, Make Space for Girls isn't about sport, it's about play. And sometimes we forget that children from 12 to 18 are still children. They should still be able to and have the facilities to play. So much focus on play is about the sort of under 10s, but older children have the right to play, meaning something that is self-directed, it's social, it's free. It doesn't necessarily have an end in sight. And for teenagers, play looks a lot like loitering. You know, this is something that is quite difficult because people think, you know, oh, those teenagers, they're just hanging around. Yes, they are, and that's fine. The important thing is that play does increase activity levels. You know, even if you're only walking 15 minutes to the park to hang out with your mates and then 15 minutes back, that's still half an hour of activity. And there's plenty of research that says that these incremental, built into your daily life types of activity are really crucial to health. And that activity for health doesn't mean running a 5K or belting around with a hockey stick or ploughing up and down the swimming pool. So play can involve increased activity levels, even if part of it to the outside observer looks a lot like people kind of loitering around. So how are we going to try and change all this? I think it is very important to focus on the design of places, and that's really where our focus is currently. We do have to recognise that behaviour of boys is problematic. We've been doing some focus groups with girls who have skateboarded and do currently skateboard. And we've heard some really interesting stories where girls have said, I love skateboarding. I've always had a really positive experience of skateboarding. For example, there was this time that I went to the skate park with my girlfriend and there were boys sitting around the top and they didn't want us there. So they started just yelling normal sort of abuse, calling us slags and things. But then they moved on to racial abuse because my friend was black. So they took it up a level. When sexual abuse didn't scare us off, they moved it up to sexual and racial abuse. When that didn't scare us off, they started chucking things at us to try and scare us off the skate park. But do you know what? We decided we weren't going to be afraid and we just stuck it out. And we finished our skateboard session and we left with our heads held high. And I saw that as a really positive experience. At which point you take a very deep breath and go, wow, that is amazing that you were able to see that as a positive experience and that you took from that the fact that you'd faced down these boys, these racist, sexist boys, you'd faced them down and moved on. But for a lot of girls, that behavior, they would never go near a skate park again. They would have left and they would have never gone near there again. So the behavior of boys, it really does need to be addressed. And it's not all boys. It's actually probably quite a small minority of boys. So enabling girls and other boys to call out that behavior and say, that's not okay. That's really, really important. Susanna sort of touched on the expectations placed on girls, particularly when it comes to sort of intersectionality, when it comes to expectations around perhaps childcare, expectations around homework and school activities. Again, they can be much higher on girls or different on girls. But all we need to do is fix these problems. Don't try and fix the girls. There's always a tendency to say, oh, if we could just make girls into really, really good skateboard and they'd take over the skate parks and everything will be fabulous. You know, let's stop trying to fix the girls. Let's try and fix the problems. You know what? The girls are probably okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with them. And one of the starting points, I think, is to try to engage with teenage girls. And I'm going to come on to this at the very end. But I'm just going to hand over to Susanna, who's going to talk a little bit about, you know, okay, we've moaned a lot about what we've got. You know, what might better look like? I'm just going to take that. Oh, you're on mute.
No, I'm not. That's better. Sorry. I'm going to speed through this at a relative speed because a lot of this stuff, all of these case studies are on our website and with links to further information about the projects. But there are 3 places, which is, it's insane that there are only 3. Anyway, there are 3 places that have really tried to see what works for teenage girls in different ways: Vienna, Malmo, and Barcelona. And what comes out of this is a set of common suggestions as to how to make things better. A lot of these are to do with safety. So better lighting, wider entrances to play areas. We've touched on this with Muggers. If it's a fenced off contained space, it doesn't feel safe. It inherently does not feel safe to girls. So breaking these up, opening up the entrances is really important. To stop boys taking over a space, subdividing up the areas. This applies to everything from a stretch of grass to a skate park. The more different spaces there are, the less easy it is for one group to take over and dominate, and they just go, fine, I'll just go somewhere else. The other approach to this is to build something so huge that nobody can dominate it. And you may laugh, but in fact, there's an enormous climbing wall in the Queen Elizabeth Park, in the old Olympic facilities, which works in exactly that way. It's so big that if somebody's taking over one bit, you just go down the other end and it really doesn't matter. Seating areas. This is really important for girls. Girls like to sit and face each other when they talk, and so much of park seating is just in lines. And that's such a simple change that can make a huge difference. Circular paths. Again, this is a safety thing. Girls want to know, as do many other groups, where does this park go? Is it a dead end? If you've got a perimeter path around the park, you're never going to be trapped. You're never going to follow a path and suddenly discover it takes you nowhere. And so also the visibility of paths, seeing where they lead, seeing where they're going is really important. Swings, it's really boring. It's really simple, and it's really inexpensive. Teenage girls love swings, and yet swings are more and more now fenced off with the equipment for young children. So if teenage girls go and use them, the mothers of the young children sort of tut and go, ooh, you know, what are these teenage girls doing, taking up the space? Whereas there should just be lots of swings in lots of places. There's been a very simple intervention in a park in New York, has just put in banks of swings with some accessible swings for those with disability, and they're completely separate for everywhere else. And in the early evenings, these are apparently full of teenage girls, and good quality toilets, which are very important for girls, particularly as teenagers when they're coming to terms with their periods. But again, it's something that benefits everybody, not just teenage girls. So next slide. The absolute leader in this is Vienna, who as a city have pursued a policy of gender mainstreaming, which simply means thinking about how their policies apply to women across the city. And it's been transformative, and they did some very particular work on parks. And the pilot project for this was a place called Einsiedler Park, which is, it says a small enclosed square. It's a small square of your Vienna. It would be quite big in a lot of cities in the UK. But the girls were passing through it and not stopping. So, and this is just as a way to think about beginning. They started by putting up hammocks, you can see there, and just things, the wooden thing that could be a space, it could be a seat, it could be a stage, and the girls started stopping to linger. And that in itself was enough to change their behaviour. So then they started on some other work. Next slide. The Muga was a problem for all the reasons we've discussed so far. So what they did was they divided it up, and again they built a thing, because so much of the skate parks and the Mugas are prescriptive, and they speak about doing activities which tend to be dominated by boys. Whereas if you build something like this, that could be a goal, it could be a seat, it could be a stage for performances again. It's open to interpretation, but it also divided up the area. So and only one half of the Muga was laid out as a pitch. So again, if the boys were playing football, there was somewhere else for the girls to go, and that made a huge difference. Next slide. they also did a very simple thing and put that bench and table there. What they discovered from their research was that a number of girls, particularly from the Turkish community, were coming to the park because they were taking younger siblings. So very simple thing, put some seating for them there so that they could actually have a social experience while they were looking after their siblings. And this shows, however much one produces generalities and guidelines, the first step always has to be talking to the girls themselves, looking at the circumstances in these very, each park is different. Each park will have girls with a different set of circumstances. Talk to them, find out what they need. Next slide. Barcelona have taken this further. They produced a feminist park which looks fantastic. It is fantastic. It's using a lot of the same ideas that the Vienna research turned up. Separate areas, safety, intervisibility. That's really about all I have to say about that. So next slide. Malmo. Malmo is, then they took it a stage further because they designed a park with a group of older teenage girls. They had a policy of turning small urban corners into parks for young people. Then after a while realized that they built 13 skate parks and these were predominantly being used by boys. So the next project, which was an old car park, was designed by, with and for girls. And what's fascinating is what they turned up. There was a climbing wall, a performance stage, which has also turned into a real community facility that you can have organized exercise classes there, but they've also used it for concerts, for community events. It's much more than just a piece of play equipment. And a really simple thing, gymnastics bars, which used to be in parks a lot and are no longer there, and which the girls specifically asked for. And again, if you go to the next slide, you can see it's, even within a small space, it is still designed as a group of spaces that different groups can coexist within, rather than it being one open space that one group can dominate on. So all of these are on our website with many more links to sort of original documents about them and more photographs if you want to have a look. So Imogen.
So what we're trying to do is firstly raise awareness so that decision makers can actually make a positive effort to seek out the voices of teenage girls. We are clearly not teenage girls, so we are not going to be able to tell people who are making decisions about parks and public spaces what teenage girls want. But what we can do is raise the awareness so that decision makers know they need to find those voices. Because as we all know, it's very easy just to listen to the voices that are there. We also want to try and influence some funders in particular at a strategic level. A lot of funders, for example, in England, in the National Lottery Fund, they like to fund skate parks because they see it very clearly in terms of a teenage provision. But let's get them interested in funding something different. And we also want to get councils to start thinking about their public sector equality duty. I don't want to bang on about it, but it's really important. It's a continuing duty that people should be thinking at from the outset, and they're not. We also want to help people in parks and public spaces create some pilots. Let's talk to girls to understand their experiences of specific locations. What is it about this park that you used to like when you came here when you were little? What do you think about the park now? How does the park make you feel? We had some really interesting research that we learned about in Sweden, where people were saying that, girls were saying a skate park, it makes us feel excited. It makes us feel positive and happy, but it also makes us feel that we are lacking capability. And it also makes us feel that there is a perform or be absurd sort of feeling about it. And it's only by understanding how places are making girls feel that you can start to try and make changes that will help them to engage more. don't be afraid that everything has to be incredibly expensive. You know, some interventions are relatively low cost. Do as they did in Vienna, maybe put up a few hammocks, see if people linger there more. Put up some swings. They're not very expensive. We were looking at a bank of swings and I think they came in at about £3,000, which is a lot of money, but compared to a skate park, which is starting price 160k, it's not. So think about low cost interventions. Eventually, what we would love to do is to work with an organisation to have a park that's designed specifically with teenage girls at the heart of the process, which is what they did at Malmo. But I think that's a long way down the line for the moment. I think at the moment, really just keeping the conversation going so that people start to listen to teenage voices. And remember, you know, teenage girls are not a homogenous mush any more than teenagers are. Location, where they are, urban, rural, suburban, and you know the other barriers that they are facing. You know, the buzzword is intersectionality, but you know, what other barriers are they facing? Are they facing barriers that are cultural, that are racial, that are class-based? You know, think about the interaction between their gender and the other barriers that they face. And this is a quote from some work that was done by Muff, who are a feminist architect firm working in Newham in London, in East London. And, you know, one of the observations from teenage girls from essentially a South Asian community was, you know, they want to be outside, but their male peers call them whores, and their families are very protective. So for them, there was a combination of wanting to be outside, but also wanting not to be too obviously visible. So for them, shelters somewhere safe, but perhaps slightly secret. I mean, that particular group of girls had taken to meeting in underpasses, which, you know, isn't great for a lot of reasons, but it met a need that they had, which was being driven not by themselves, but by the culture they're operating within. Do seek out the voices of teenage girls. Don't consult at the park because they're not going to be there. So often park consultation, you stick up the leaflet and the banner goes up on the gates of the park. We are consulting about what your park should look like in 2031. Go to www. blah, 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 blah. The teenage girls are never going to see that. So try and find ways to reach out to them. Schools, youth clubs, youth associations, girl guides, you know, anywhere where girls congregate. Make sure that you give the opportunity to girls to speak just as a group of girls. Life can be quite complicated because, yes, some of the boys' behavior when you are a teenage girl is very difficult, but these boys are part of your peer group. They're part of your class group. You want them to be your friends. You might want them to be more than your friends. And it's very difficult with that dynamic if the boys are sitting there to call out the sort of behavior or to say the sort of things that you might want to say in a single sex group. So do think about consulting just with girls as a group, but we mustn't leave the boys out because the boys are such an important part of making places more welcome. And stuff around role play and, you know, the Swedish, it would be in Sweden, they did this marvelous thing where they actually did a theatre performance around how different public spaces made boys and girls feel. And as young actors, they articulated that so that people could watch it and react to it. But as I say, you have to have the boys in the conversation as well. That's absolutely essential. But think about creating a space where girls can speak. And don't just listen to the users of parks. I mean, you know, that's actually a quote from Skateboard GB, who are, you know, the lead and the lead funded GB skateboard body. Their position, most successful skate park, is one that is attuned to the needs of its local riders. But those local riders are all going to be young men, predominantly white. You're going to end up with, as Susanna said, this kind of exclusive by design approach to designing spaces. Co-production, absolutely important, working with girls to produce things and remembering our target outcomes, you know, places where teenage girls can make positive, meaningful choices about how they spend their time in parks, about spending times in parks from a range of options. So with apologies for overrunning, that's all we wanted to say before we opened up the floor for questions and discussions. I've just put up there our website details, and you know, our Twitter handle and our email. So if anybody does want to get in contact, please do, you know, contact us via our email.